Back to our plenary talks today, this afternoon.
And we are very excited to move from the realm of psychiatry and of therapy into some different answers to the questions that we've been asking through this conference. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Mackenzie Cooley. I'm a grad student in the history department.
I'm Jill Rosenthal, and I'm an acting assistant professor teaching African history in the history department.
And we are absolutely thrilled to introduce our two upcoming speakers. So for these plenary talks, we just wanted to remind you that there is actually a Twitter handle developing around the conference. And so if you were interested in participating in this electronic space, we would absolutely encourage you to check out Soul Wounds 2015.
And also, just as a reminder, there is no food or drinks allowed in this room, unfortunately, so just please keep that in mind. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Angelika Balmer. Angelika Balmer is an associate professor of interdisciplinary humanities and comparative literature at Emory University. Her work explores the relationships between history and memory, and between how we experience things in selves and how we represent ourselves and our identities within scholarship. Dr. Balmer also has an interest in different modes of academic production and the creative possibilities of scholarly writing, particularly around the construction of narrative and sites of memory. Angelika received her undergraduate degree in philosophy from Heidelberg University and her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She has received fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Humanities Center. She is the author of Partial Visions, Feminism and Utopianism in the 1970s, which is being reissued in a significantly expanded edition, an updated edition. She is also the editor of Displacements, Cultural Identities in Question, and the producer of a multimedia installation of her work on memory sites, destruction, loss, and transformation. Her co-edited volume on the future of scholarly writing, Critical Interventions, will be coming out this fall. Currently, Dr. Balmer is completing a study of the transmission of history across 4 generations in the form of a personal narrative entitled Born After, A German Reckoning. She also plans to revise a set of reflections on the wounds of history and the work of memory into a book manuscript form, and her talk today is entitled The Work of Memory and the Wounds of History. Please join me in welcoming Professor Balmer.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that this is a really amazing conference, and how rare it is to be at a conference where activists, scholars, artists, people from the media all come together to explore shared concerns, and I'm honored and grateful to have been invited to participate, so thank you to all the organizers. I thought that I could best honor the creative spirit of this conference by departing somewhat from the conventions of standard academic presentation. So I'll still make an argument, but I'll do so by using images and stories. In the most general sense, my talk is about history and memory, particularly the wounds left by what Nietzsche described as pasts that have not stopped hurting, and the forms of remembrance that might help them heal. My talk is organized around a few case studies. The first, and by far the longest, is a group of Holocaust memorials in Germany, 2 by a pair of German conceptual artists, and 1 by an American architect. The second is a film about the rule of terror under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, by a Cambodian filmmaker. The third, which I'll only touch on briefly, is a response to the AIDS crisis in Africa in the form of memory books, memory boxes, and body maps. Conceptually, my talk is framed by 2 key terms. Memory work, the first term, memory work and its correlative mourning work, Erinnerungsarbeit, and Trauerarbeit, respectively, in the original German, and the second term, working through, or as the German puts it, durcharbeiten. What connects them is the emphasis on work, memory work, morning work, and the process of working through something that took place in the past, but is still present in its effects. It still troubles us, haunts us, shapes who we are and what we do. It's a past that, as Faulkner wrote, isn't dead yet. Experientially speaking, it isn't even past. I'll explain what these terms mean, or perhaps more precisely what they mean to me, by using the case studies as my material and Freud as my conceptual point of reference. My overarching question is this: can acts of remembering and particular memorial practices help heal the wounds of historical trauma? My answer, offered less as a claim than as a wager, is this: acts of remembering and particular memorial practices can help heal the wounds of historical trauma if they constitute memory work, an active and intentional working through of the feelings of loss that this past entails. Working through loss in this sense means identifying what the thing or things that we lost have meant to us, how they marked who we thought we were, and what we are or can be without them, altered, perhaps diminished, yet intact. What matters in this memory work is not the nature of the thing we lost. It might be someone we loved, but they died, or left us, or betrayed us. But as Freud notes in Mourning and Melancholia, it might equally be, quote, the loss of some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, or an ideal. What matters to the process of memory work is how we work through the loss, with the emphasis on the word work. With this as my framework, I turn to my first case study. Oops, sorry. Imagine yourself in this scene. You're in Berlin. Just ahead is the iconic Berlin landmark, the Brandenburg Gate, built around the time of the French Revolution as a symbol of peace. You're at a bus stop, getting ready to board a tour bus, heading to Ravensbrück. Just 90 kilometers north of Berlin, a little over an hour's ride. It was a Nazi concentration camp for women that provided slave labor for Siemens Electrical Engineering Company. Between 1939 and 1945, around 130,000 women, Polish, Jewish, Russian, French, Dutch, were interned in the Ravensbrück camp. You came early to visit the information center on your right. To learn about Ravensbrück, you looked at maps, listened to eyewitness accounts, perused the list of names on the interactive computer program. You bought a booklet about the history of Ravensbrück to read on the way. You spent time preparing for this trip, and you will spend more time on the bus itself, thinking about what you learned, what it means to you, perhaps talking with others on the way. This was the idea behind the memorial project. For bus stop, it's a memorial, not a regular bus. As the artist who designed the memorial put it, quote, you take your time and you give it to the dead. By spending your time in this way, you're engaging in an act of remembrance that is intentional. It takes commitment, it requires effort, and the investment of resources. You're doing memory work. Before your bus leaves for Ravensbrück, you take stock of where you are. For remembering may be about the past, but is always located in the present. You notice that the bus stop to Ravensbrück is in the heart of Berlin's most expensive real estate. Ahead on the right is the Adlon Hotel, Berlin's famous historic luxury hotel, where the likes of the last Russian Tsar Nicholas II, industrialists like Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller, and movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Marlene Dietrich once stayed. The American embassy is ahead on the elegant Pariser Square. The German parliament, the historic Reichstag, is just a block to the left. This is the symbolic center of cultural and political and financial power. This is where the bus to Ravensbrück starts. You notice that it's a one-way street. Einbahnstraße. You could have gone to any number of places. The bus schedule offers many options. Sachsenhausen, Riga, Drancy, Bergen-Belsen, Babi Yar, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz. You can go to any of the most infamous, as well as many of the lesser-known sites of Nazi terror and genocide, slave labor camps, concentration camps, extermination camps. You have to consider how much time you have and are willing to spend on this trip. You consult the timetable. How long does it take to get to some of these places? To Auschwitz, for example, the bus takes about 8 hours. You would spend the night there and return the next day around midnight. Dachau is definitely more manageable. Just outside of Munich, it is the oldest Nazi concentration camp, and over the 12 years of its operation, it held close to 200,000 men and women prisoners. You can get there and back from Berlin in a single day. Babi Yar would require a much bigger time commitment. To get to this place outside of Kiev, where Germans massacred the city's entire Jewish population, close to 34,000 people, in just 2 days, would take, as the timetable notes, 24 hours just to get there. You may not have that much time. Perhaps you don't want to take that much time. But perhaps the shock of the distance makes you think of how far Germans went, literally, across the expanse of Europe all the way to Asia to carry out their genocidal program. And perhaps you might imagine what it would have been like for those who were deported, usually to their death, across such distances of such magnitude, not in air-conditioned, comfortable tour buses like the one you're on, but in unheated, windowless cattle cars, bare walls, and a hard plank floor. This act of identification, putting yourself into another's shoes, is another dimension of historical memory work. In the end, you choose the bus to Buchenwald. Not only was this one of the largest Nazi concentration camps, some 250,000 people were imprisoned there, few of whom survived. But you could stop on the way in Weimar, the heart of German classical culture, where the legacy of Goethe and Schiller presents Germany in a different light, as the land of poets and thinkers. You're perhaps reminded of this other Germany as your bus drives past the German Historical Museum, which you see as the pink building in the back. Well, it's kind of gray here, but it's actually pink. And the site of the infamous Nazi book burning on the Opera Square that your bus is just passing on the left. Over the next hours on your way to Buchenwald, you'll have time to ponder this contradiction of these different Germanys and your relationship to them. Which of them are you invested in, and how? As love, as loss, as ambivalence, or perhaps indifference? Sorting this out in a full and honest way might require working through attachments and losses that you have not chosen to engage in this way before. Starting to do so is a step along the path of memory work. Bus stop was the proposal submitted by two Berlin-based conceptual artists, Renata Stich and Frieder Schnock, to the competition for a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe that had been under discussion for a number of years and was officially announced in 1949. That's my history coming back to haunt me. In 1995, a few years after German unification. The stipulation was that it must be centrally located in Berlin, the recently restored capital of a reunified Germany. Bus stop was a deliberate provocation. Instead of a monument, Stich and Schnock proposed what James E. Young has termed a counter-monument, one that refuses to do the work of remembering for us, leaving us to do the work ourselves. The problem with traditional monuments, Young explains, is that they don't so much, quote, remember events as bury them beneath layers of national myths and explanations. Rather than embodying memory, the monument displaces it, supplanting a community's memory work with its own material form. Instead of asking us to remember, the traditional monument allows us to forget. Young again. To the extent that we encourage monuments to do our memory work for us, we become that much more forgetful. Not allowing us to become forgetful was the goal of Bus Stop. Instead of a monument, Stich and Schnock proposed a journey. Red buses with the names of their destinations marked, Auschwitz, for example, or Buchenwald, would drive to actual concentration camps and death camps. It was not a memorial where VIPs could lay down wreaths on official visits. It was an occasion for individual acts of active remembrance. As the artist wrote, there is no need for monumental construction to commemorate the victims. A visit to a former concentration camp creates uneasiness. The earth trembles, and the knowledge of atrocious events sears into memory. However, Bus Stop was not funded. This memorial was. Over 8 years in the making, this design by the American architect Peter Eisenman, known more for his theoretical writing than for his built architecture, is nothing if not monumental. Roughly the size of 2 football fields, it is made of 2,700 concrete slabs of radically varying height, some up to 15 feet, others just a few inches, arranged in a massive grid. It is located in the same place where Stich and Schnock's bus stop would have been. But unlike their actual buses, that would have gone to actual places, this field of stele, they are officially referred to by this anglicized Greek word, is a model of abstract post-minimalism. Eisenman explains it thus, quote, "It reveals the instability inherent in an inherently unstable system, such as a state, a system of laws, a social order. While the, quote, perceptual and conceptual divergence it creates thwarts any paradigmatic understanding of its formal arrangement." End of quote. But this very thwarting of paradigmatic understanding may be beside the point, if the point is not to theorize but to remember. For remembering, at least in the active form of memory work that I'm proposing, is not an intellectual exercise, a mere work of thinking, but a work of feeling thinking, of feelings made conscious, articulated, owned. And the general response to the Eisenman Memorial is that, while it is brilliant, its effect is less visceral than intellectual. You know what you are supposed to think, thwarting of paradigmatic understanding. But as the review in the LA Times put it, you never feel it. The effect is more like a game. either a play on the familiar trope of the impossibility of Holocaust representation, or an outright game, as the behavior of many visitors to the site shows. Some run or jump across the stele as if it were a giant hopscotch game. Others, and not just children, play hide and seek. While yet others find the stele a welcome place to sit and relax in the bustle of a busy city, get some sun, check their cell phone, or meet friends before going to one of the trendy restaurants nearby. As its website boasts, in 2006, Peter Eisenman's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe was voted the best cultural space by the industry magazine, Travel and Leisure. And the British Guild of Travel Writers awarded it second place in their, quote, Globe Award for Best Worldwide Tourism Project. The last entry on the website's history of the memorial was that Victoria of Sweden and her husband Prince Daniel had visited. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was the previous visitor mentioned by the site. Oops. Yep, that's where I want to be. If a memorial can't do our memory work for us because we have to do that work ourselves, the question is how to go about it. What would this memory work look like? What would it entail? Stich and Schnuck gave a partial answer. You take your time and you give it to the dead. Their attention to the dead was apt. When Sigmund Freud, German and English sometimes mix in my mouth. When Sigmund Freud introduced the concept of memory work, Erinnerungsarbeit, which literally in German means to put something inside, erinnern. It has the root inner, which we have in English as well. And the related concept of mourning work, Trauerarbeit, when Freud introduced these terms in a set of essays written between 1914 and 1919, and when he identified these concepts as a defining framework for therapy with patients who suffer from a past that they can't forget. Giving time to the dead in remembrance and mourning was very much at issue in Europe and the world at large, as the slaughter of World War I was in full swing. By the time it was over, and Freud reflected in his essay on the uncanny, on the unstable boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead, such that even memory work can't always free us of the haunting presence of those who are no longer there. The war had cost around 37 million casualties, 17 million of them dead. On a single day of horror in the Battle of the Somme alone, the British Army lost 58,000 men, 20,000 of them fatally. Memorials to the fallen, like the one on this image, dedicated to the 6,000 men of Hamburg's 76th Infantry Regiment killed in World War I, would mark the trauma of this war across Europe for the following decades, even to this day, as evidenced by the spray-painted graffiti on the monument's pedestal, "Never Again, Germany." Beginning with his 1914 essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through his meditation on transience, and his landmark essay on mourning and melancholia the following year, to his 1919 essay, The Uncanny, Loss, and How We Deal with It, sometimes crippled, sometimes haunted, occasionally redeemed, but always changed by it, emerged as a central issue in Freud's investigation of human suffering and psychic health. Yet while these essays span the very years of the so-called Great War, the concepts of memory work and mourning work, as Freud elaborates them here, don't deal with trauma on a collective level, but with trauma as it registers individually. Memory work for Freud is not about what Susan Sontag has called the pain of others. It is about each person's own experience of pain and loss. It might be the loss of a loved one, or it might be the loss of a loved one, or as Freud elaborates in Morning Melancholia, and I'll repeat what I said earlier, it might be the loss of some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, or an ideal. And think of the millions of displaced persons around the world for whom that loss is an everyday experience. But what if the loss in question is not our own personal loss, but, to quote Sontag again, the pain of others? What would memory work or mourning work mean then? Would the terms as Freud used them even apply in such a case? For example, can we remember and by extension mourn something as general and thus invariably transpersonal as a genocide? Can we, quote, work through and mourn trauma on the level of, say, the Holocaust, the enslavement of African Americans, ethnic cleansing in places like Bosnia or Rwanda, the so-called AIDS crisis, or other instances in the litany of traumatic histories? I confess that I'm skeptical. The difficulties are immense. But if we have any chance of doing so beyond well-meaning but ultimately empty rhetoric of always remember, never forget, it would require a counterintuitive move. It would require shifting the focus from them to us. Instead of focusing on their suffering and talking about them, we would have to ask ourselves, what does their loss mean to us? What do we grieve in remembrance of their grief? Put most starkly, who are they to us? I'm going to go over this very quickly. This is a longish quote from Freud's Morning Melancholia. I just want to very, very cursorily go over what Freud proposes or argues are the steps in that process. The first is you have to acknowledge that the loss is real, which begins with the courage to admit that something is troubling us, that we want to face, not turn away from. The loss is real, he says. The loved object no longer exists. Step 2 follows from this realization. We have to withdraw our attachments to that object. Withdraw its attachments to that object. And but the real work, as Freud describes it, or as he puts it, the arduous process of working through, begins with that realization, with the fact that this order to withdraw our affective attachments to an object can't be done at once, can't be obeyed at once. It has to be done bit by bit, at great expense and emotional energy. You have to dredge up each single one of the memories and expectations that marked your attachment to this thing or person you loved. Recognize what it meant to you, and recognize what you've lost in the process of its absence. In the parlance of neuroscience, this would be called an elaborated memory. And again, at the heart of elaborated, there's the word labor, which again reinforces the notion of work. What we're reminded of is that this isn't the ready rhetorical gesture of I remember X, but a detailed and repeated return to the particular dimensions of the thing in question and what it meant to you. So why would we do this if it requires such great expense of time and cathectic energy? Because, and this is the final point in Freud's argument, it's only if you recognize in each single one of the memories and expectations what this thing or person that you've now lost meant to you, will you be able to understand and thus grieve its loss. And only then will you be able to put the loss in the past, not forget about it, but know that it is final, so that you can devote your energies to the present and the future you would like to shape. Obviously, no memorial could do such memory work for us, but it could provide a facilitating framework. Before Bus Stop, the artist duo Stich and Schnuck created a memorial with just this intention. Located in an urban, middle-class neighborhood in the heart of Berlin, Places of Remembrance remembers a time when the Bavarian Quarter was the center of a vibrant Jewish culture, home to many well-to-do Jews, doctors, lawyers, business people, artists, and intellectuals, who had settled here around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. They included the photographer Giselle Freund, the political theorist Hannah Arendt, and the physicist Albert Einstein, whom neighbors would see shuffling to the corner store in his slippers to get his morning paper. In 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power, over 16,000 Jews lived in the Bavarian Quarter. 12 years later, when the regime collapsed, there were none. How did this happen, and what exactly did happen, were the questions that got this project started. In 1988, a neighborhood resident decided to find out. Drawing on Nazi-era property records, he unearthed the names of over 6,000 Jewish residents in the neighborhood. And these sheets are just, I've got thousands more. Where they'd lived, their dates of birth, and places and dates of death. The Berlin Senate proposed a memorial commemorating this history, and the artist Stich and Schnuck took it from there. A German legal scholar, Josef Walk, that's the book on the left there, had compiled a compendium of Nazi-era laws and ordinances pertaining to Jews, and the artist used Walk's research to show how a genocide unfolds, ordinance by ordinance, law by law, in full public view, step by step. The full title of their memorial highlights this process: Places of Remembrance in the Bavarian Quarter, Exclusion and Deprivation of Rights, Persecution, Deportation, and Murder of Berlin Jews in the years between 1933 and 1945. The Berlin Senate had envisioned a memorial centrally located by the subway stop Bavarian Square, which you see there, easily accessible, visible, with immediate impact. But Stich and Schnuck created something different. At first, you don't even see it, and you never see it all at once. To see it in its entirety and get the full impact of their memorial, you have to make an intentional effort and put the pieces it is made of together. For like the genocide it commemorates, it unfolds incrementally. It is there, but hidden in plain sight. You can see part of it in the clock sign on the lamppost on the right. This clock sign is one of 80 such signs displayed throughout the neighborhood. The locations are marked by the green dots on the historical map. They look just like ordinary street signs. I discovered this memorial by accident. It was winter, and I was visiting the neighborhood and cut through a little corner park with a bright red bench. I happened to look up and notice a sign with a red bench attached to the lamppost directly across from me. Puzzled, what would a sign with a bench on it indicate? I walked around it and read the following on the reverse side of the red bench sign. Quote, "Around the Bavarian Square, Jews may only use the yellow benches, of which there were none, as far as I could tell." I was too shocked at first to notice that the date underneath this ordinance was 1939. The present tense of the wording, "Jews may not use the benches," sounded current. Nor did I notice the smaller sign attached beneath it, which you can barely see hanging there, explaining that this was part of a memorial from 1993. I saw another sign around the corner. On the image side, it showed an empty bird cage. On the reverse side was an excerpt from testimony dated 1943. I'll read it. That's the German, this is the English. We had a budgie. When the ordinance was passed that Jews weren't allowed to have pets, my husband couldn't bear to part with this animal. Maybe someone denounced him, because one day my husband was summoned to the Gestapo. After many weeks filled with fear, I got a postcard from the police that for a fee of 3 Reichsmark, I could collect the urn with my husband's ashes. I suddenly realized that this was not your usual memorial. Instead of pathos or the heroizing language of victimhood, it used the language of public communication, colorful images in the abstracted style of commercial slogans or standard street signs, texts that distilled material from the Nazi years, laws, ordinances, eyewitness accounts, into short, snappy messages in simple words. An aesthetics of normality, as the artist put it. Neither monumental nor peremptory, this was a memorial that eschewed grand gestures, but it was subtle, like a punch in the face. Each sign was like a mini memorial, a pearl necklace with an ordinance dated February 21st, 1939, announced, quote, Jews have to give up their jewelry and all objects made of gold, silver, platinum, and pearls. A sign featuring a German shepherd conveyed 2 separate ordinances. The first from 1936 decreed, quote, Jewish veterinarians are no longer allowed to practice. The second from 1939 announced an across-the-board exclusion of Jews from all professions that would require state certification. Cumulatively, these ordinances map the path toward genocide. Yet, then as now, everyday life continues. Children play, couples walk hand in hand. Maybe they're shocked by the signs. Maybe they've gotten used to them. Maybe they don't notice them because their attention is on other things. As I walk through the neighborhood following the trail of signs, I'm in the present and the past at once. As the history of a murderous past dogs my steps, past and present blur. A man with a cane walks past a sign with a cane. Boys on cell phones walk by a sign from the Nazi years prohibiting Jews from using public telephones. This is how Freud describes the process of working through a troubling past. You bring it into the present, bit by bit, gradually and over time, to ask yourself, what do the events of this other time mean to me as I'm living and want to live now? At regular intervals, the signs confront me with a choice about this past. Do I look away or just walk on and ignore them? How do I respond to the question they ask me? Did you know about this? And what does knowing about it matter now? The dead are dead. What would you have done if you had been here then? The signs don't assume that I'm guilty or innocent, but neither do they let me off the hook. A woman with shopping bags walks under a sign informing me that starting July 4th, 1940, it's time, right? So the idea was that these signs are always in the context. Here, this is a sign by the Bavarian Quarter Post Office, which is yellow like the post office sign and like German mailboxes. On the reverse of the sign is an excerpt from a letter dated before being deported, March 16th, 1942. The time has finally come. I have to leave tomorrow, and that is obviously an enormous blow. I will write you. And a boy walks by, perhaps arriving from or departing to somewhere. Finally, at the edge of Bavarian Square, there is this sign. It is the only one without an image, just a blank space, no color, just black. On the reverse, a simple line dated October 23rd, 1941. Jews are not allowed to leave. 3 months later, the so-called final solution of the Jewish problem is decided. And what we remember as the Holocaust proceeds from there. I'll just read one more paragraph and then end. So all the Khmer Rouge stuff and the AIDS in Africa, that will be for another another time. What do I do with this knowledge? Is this a memory that I, or anyone for that matter, can work through? Particularly if I didn't experience it myself. And what would experiencing it even mean concretely? The promise or hope that we can learn from the past, much less heal its wounds by acts of memory, can be challenged in all kinds of ways. For one, instead of healing wounds, remembering might reopen them. This is Primo Levi's point in his essay, The Memory of Offense. For another, the experience in question might be impervious or inaccessible to acts of memory. This is the claim at the heart of Kathy Kruth's trauma theory. Finally, one might say, as the historian Elko Runia does, that we can't prevent the past from happening again. It's already happened. Challenges like these haunt the work of artists whose work engages historical traumas through a form of witnessing, or what Dora Appel calls secondary witnessing. And I'm going to end with my very last slide, so I'm just going to quickly click through them. It is a Jewish tradition, so this will be my ending. It is a Jewish tradition to say to the family of a person who has died, "I wish you a long life." In reference to this tradition, the women of the Bambanani Women's Group in Cape Town chose "Long Life" as the title for the book publication of their Body Maps project. Each image is a full-size body tracing with decorations and annotations that tell the story of the maker's inner and outer selves, the life she's lived, who she is now, and what she wants the next generation to remember. Each map carries the name, date, and place of birth, as well as handprints and footprints of its maker. These are memory maps created by women who are either HIV positive or suffering from AIDS. At the time these maps were created, in 2002-2003, AIDS had left around 13 million orphans in sub-Saharan Africa. In South Africa alone, between 4 to 5 million people were infected with HIV virus, and an estimated 600 people were dying each day. In the midst of this crisis, and I've got half a page left. In the midst of this crisis, public health workers working with African AIDS patients in London in the early 1990s developed the Memory Book Project in response to their patients' wish to create a legacy of family memories and cultural knowledge to pass on to their children when they died. Within a few years, the Memory Book Project was carried from England to Uganda and on from there, gradually expanding to include not just memory books, but memory boxes, even memory baskets, and eventually the body maps, so that people could tell their stories in forms that didn't assume or require literacy. But whatever form they took, these memory projects all shared one purpose. They dealt with the past in order to preserve a living future for the next generation. They created a past that could be remembered forward. The principle underlying memory work is that things don't just happen, they happen to us. How we define that us marks our place in history. The responsibility we take for whatever history we consider ours begins there. It is in this taking of responsibility for the relationship between past and future that memory work, working through the unfinished business of the past, can make a critical difference. If instead of trying to heal the wounds of the past, we could envision trying to heal the future, such memory work, hand in hand with imagination, might be our most generative hope. I wish you a long life. Thank you.
Would you please use my question time to talk a little bit about Cambodia? Maybe 2 or 3 minutes?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, awesome. It's easier if I can just get to the details. So my starting point was the question, how does one remember a genocide? And the fact that in the history that I mostly deal with, which is European history, and the trauma of the Holocaust, we invoke numbers, 6 million. And so I start with this. 20. Just a second. Shouldn't have grabbed these the way I did. When the trauma in question is of such magnitude that it exceeds our ability to encompass it as an experience, I think we often resort to numbers, because numbers give us the illusion that we can grasp something. And I think that numbers beg the question. And I give you here just a few. So in the Cambodian, during the not even 4 years of the rule of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, about an estimated, there's no number, 20,000 people were killed. So that's another number, 6 million, 20,000. And I tried to just grapple with that question, what does it mean to remember that? So here you have 119 little photographs of Cambodian citizens, men, women, children, who were photographed by their Khmer Rouge guards, often their executioners before they were murdered. Here we have 40 of them. Is that easier to grasp? Or 28? Or 8? Or 6? Or 2? Or could we really only grasp things, history, on the human scale of a person we encounter face to face in their singular humanity? And the Cambodian filmmaker Rithi Pan has grappled with this question in his work. He has made, this is a quote from him, I had to find a way to work with my memories. And the film that I primarily wanted to just at least introduce you to and mention to you is this film that he made in 2013, The Missing Picture. after a year and a half of working on the filming, he finally, as he said, I had to find a way to work with my memories. He found the way, and the way was to create little figures out of clay and recreate, as it were, memory landscapes from scratch. Figures made, sculpted in clay, then carved, then painted, and inserted into the remembered landscapes of his childhood. He was 13 when Pol Pot's army took Phnom Penh. Barely 4 years later, when Pol Pot was deposed, Rithipan's family was dead, as were a quarter of the population of Cambodia. And there was something about this is, I imagine, him and his parents. And there's something about, throughout the film, when you see the film, you see constant close-up images of a human hand working these little clay figures, carving them, almost cradling them in their hand, but shaping them into the resemblance of what his memory takes him back to. But in the process, he also goes back to the sites of his childhood and what he did then, so that again in his work, past and present come together. When I was a child, he says, sometimes we would go to the river to collect clay, to make animals, wagons, or houses, small characters, and we would make up stories. I had to go back to my childhood to tell the story. So that's another example of memory work, but not as in the case of Stich and Schnock, where their memorials enjoin us, the visitors, us to do the memory work, but in this case, he's doing it himself as someone who experienced the history in question, not as someone who's inheriting it as a legacy. So that would be a difference. That was slightly disjointed, but... Pardon? The Missing Picture in English. It was made in French and then translated.
I think we'll take one more question.
Pardon?
One more question?
Sure, if I may.
You're my advisor, so I don't know if I should take up the question.
You can ask it later.
I can ask it later. Or I can ask it now.
Go.
I'm wondering about the work with the signs where they're integrated into the community. Have you thought about the way that it impacts different audiences? So like if survivors are walking through that space and see those signs, you know, what is their relationship to that memorial, and how is it maybe something triggering?
I couldn't possibly answer that,
Yeah, well,
but I would imagine very different.
yeah.
But I think the point of the memorial, and I think that's exactly what your question really is about,
Right.
is that each person is confronted
Right.
with the choice. It's not even a necessary confrontation with those questions. Who are you to this history, to this present, to this neighborhood? So obviously for survivors, and again, depending on where they're from,
Right.
it would have a very different impact.
But you haven't seen anything about survivor responses to in your work, in your research, you haven't located any survivor responses to this particular piece?
Well, in the neighborhood, all the Jews, there were none. There are Jews again in Berlin, but from elsewhere.
Okay.
The Jewish community of Berlin was very supportive of this particular memorial project, so that I do know.
Right. For the families of
No, I don't. I don't have any information on that.
Well, thank you once again for a wonderful presentation, and we will have a chance to have comparative questions after our second plenary speaker.
I'm sorry. Can you access yours now? Do you know how to get to this?
Yeah, do we have a second? Sorry. No worries, do your thing.
Oh, that's not it, sorry.
So, last year, Laura Stokes approached me about working on an intergenerational trauma and healing conference. And when we started discussing public scholarship and work within and without the academia, Lyra Monteiro's work is the first that came to my mind. So I'm thrilled that she's able to join us today. Professor Monteiro is a scholar plus, but you can tell that just by looking at her Twitter handle, the intersectionist. In her early career, she studied archaeology and public humanities, classical materials alongside modern reactions to them. In her work as a professor, she is engaged in academic debates about perceptions of the ancient pasts and worked through public history projects, museums, and memorials. She has constantly pushed beyond the traditional boundaries, academic and otherwise, unwilling to alienate either the personal or the academic or the political, the academic from the ethical. Her work bridges those gaps. She's currently an assistant professor at Rutgers. Lyra received her PhD from Brown University in 2012 and specializes in public humanities, early United States history, and race and ethnic identity. Her dissertation, Racializing the Ancient World, Ancestry and Identity in the Early United States, explored how ideas of antiquity were mobilized in the service of organizing race in a slaveholding republic, predicated on equality, but erected on exclusion and difference. Focusing on the period between the American Revolution and the start of the Civil War, her work analyzes objects, performances, and spaces in the early United States in which Greece, Rome, and Egypt were evoked as racial ancestors of either white or black Americans. Her studies analyzed Egyptian mummies and classical sculptures displayed and studied in museums and medical schools, theatrical representations of Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, and Egyptians, and the classicizing landscapes of the southern slave plantations. But beyond just this, Dr. Monteiro also co-directs the Museum On Site, a public art project that aims to help people understand their worlds through site-specific, free public experiences that share ideas and information in very accessible and stimulating ways. Previous projects have included an installation at the public festival Waterfire Providence, combining public performances and participatory ritual to address the history and legacy of Rhode Island's transatlantic slave trade. A photo-based diorama is one of her other projects, and this is in a busy downtown street in Providence, Rhode Island, displayed in a store window with labels that share stories from past and present, buildings and things on 2 blocks, and finally a pop-up museum that filled a real street with hundreds of museum labels about that street. So she has also worked on curatorial, educational, and developmental projects for over a dozen museums and cultural institutions, including the Hafenrefer Museum of Anthropology, the Harvard Art Museum, Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and one of my personal favorites, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. Her work has been supported by the John Carter Brown Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Mellon Foundation. Without further ado, we welcome her into her talk, We Are Trauma's Children, Ritual, Narrative, and the Creation of Collective Identity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie, for that really generous introduction. And also, I'd like to thank you and Laura as well for the invitation to speak here today and to reconsider my work from a slightly different angle than I have been, specifically reconsidering it through the lens of trauma. Before I start my own talk, though, I wanted to just kind of, by way of linking my material to Angelika's amazing presentation, this idea of statistics and the idea of numbers really brought to mind for me immediately a quote from a person who unfortunately and regrettably wasn't able to be here, James Campbell, who's a professor in the history department here at Stanford, who wrote, "We are inured to statistics. They pervade our world, tiny measures of incalculable suffering. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, 250,000 dead in the Indian Ocean tsunamis of 2004, 5.4 million slaughtered in the continuing carnage in the Great Lakes region of Africa. The figures wash over us, confirming the wisdom of the novelist Eric Maria Remarque, whose experience on the Western Front during the First World War taught him something about wholesale dying. Quote, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic." In titling my talk, We Are Trauma's Children, I mean to signal a couple of things. Firstly, I'd like to suggest that trauma is ubiquitous, that it is not the exception, but rather the rule of life in unjust worlds such as our own. Each of us is the product of multiple traumas. We define ourselves by some, while others are latent. But all of these traumas have shaped who we are, and we are, in that sense, trauma's children. Secondly, the emphasis on we, a collective pronoun, which I intentionally leave without an antecedent, signifies all of the many we's, the many collective identity groups that each of us belongs to. However, such groups do not exist as ideal types waiting to be populated by individuals. Rather, we create them, socially and culturally, in a variety of ways. One constant, I argue, is the role that collective trauma plays in shaping every group identity. In this regard as well, we are trauma's children. I'd also like to start out by clarifying what I mean by collective trauma. I'm borrowing Ron Eierman's definition here from his discussion of cultural trauma in the creation of African American identity, where he defines it as, quote, a memory accepted and publicly given credence by a relevant membership group and evoking an event or situation which is A, laden with negative affect, B, represented as indelible, and C, regarded as threatening to a society's existence or violating one or more of its fundamental cultural presumptions. I follow Eierman as well in making a distinction between mass trauma and collective trauma, the former being experienced by a large number of individuals, but not recognized or given the kind of memory work that collective traumas are. However, that mass trauma still has impacts on and implications for the collectivity, which it affects as latent trauma until acknowledged collectively. Over generations, these traumas, even and perhaps especially when they are latent, are what Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart describes as historical trauma, which she defines as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. For an event or experience to become a collective trauma, it does require the explicit articulation of memory work, which refers to the variety of narratives, speeches, holidays, ceremonies, rituals, museums, monuments, etc., that we create in order to shape and preserve the memory of certain experiences and events. That said, other traumas do affect all members of a collectivity without becoming collective traumas. We can, as I've suggested, think of these as mass traumas, which survivors suffer as individuals without the support of the collective. These traumas lie in a state of latency, which is not to say that they do not act in the world. A powerful expression of this, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the moment when undergraduate women and students of color suddenly become aware of the traumatic experiences of their daily existences through courses in gender studies and race and ethnicity. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Their new awareness and ability to articulate these traumas does not mean that they were unaffected by them previously. And as hard as it is to learn about oppression, that knowledge does have a liberatory function. The consequences of this kind of consciousness raising can be explosive, of course, as we've seen in the recent revolutions of the Arab Spring and the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to talk today about two different contexts in which mass trauma isn't or hasn't been acknowledged as collective trauma. First, I'll be looking in depth at colonial and early United States culture to see how this played out in the formation of American identity. Then I'll turn to a 21st century context where memory work has begun to acknowledge latent mass traumas. Trauma is an amazingly powerful creative force in our world, a property which a few papers at this conference have referred to as post-traumatic growth. Trauma creates many things: great works of art and entirely new art forms, diseases and psychopathies, museums and monuments. Indeed, a case could be made for arguing that human culture, all of it, is a reaction to trauma. And as such, all of human culture represents the scars of past traumas. Among the many products of trauma are collective identities. Much work on cultural trauma presupposes the existence of a collective group that, as an already existing group, experiences a trauma together. However, what I find most interesting is not how existing identity groups deal with trauma, but rather how trauma appears to be a necessary factor in the creation of collective identities in the first place. One of the important contributions of post-colonial critiques of Western approaches to trauma is how they have brought attention to the fact that, for all but the most fortunate and insulated members of society, trauma comes not simply in the form of events, but also in daily life experiences. In addition to powerfully traumatic experiences like assault, natural disaster, and terrorism, it can also emerge from oppression in its many forms, accumulating over the years. Being treated as different and treating others as different can also be traumatic, though the trauma may only be recognizable when one's consciousness is raised. It does not mean that the trauma is not experienced, processed, and integrated into one's psyche and one's approach to the world. Similarly, our awareness of the flip side of the trauma of survivors, the trauma of perpetrators, means that we ought to look for evidence of that trauma as well, even among those who seem unimpacted by the ills of their society. What, for example, is the impact of the perpetrator trauma of perpetuating white privilege? What about male privilege or class privilege? This insight allows us to see how trauma, whether of the victim or the perpetrator, is truly at the base of all collective identities. However, it is not always acknowledged as such. Often the originating traumas that define a people fade into obscurity, and those who identify with a given collective identity may not be able to articulate what their origin was. Take, for example, white Americans. What trauma created that collective identity? I'd like to propose that European colonists' shared identity was forged through the shared traumas of being the perpetrators of settler colonialism and of slavery. These traumas have, for the most part, been latent in the group consciousness of white Americans, but recent and ongoing memory work is increasingly bringing aspects of them to light. The first group of English colonists who truly came to stay in North America were already distinguished as a collectivity before they crossed the ocean. They had suffered from multiple traumas of religious persecution in their homeland, as well as multiple emigrations, leading them to undertake a journey across the sea to an unknown world. As a coping mechanism, the Puritan colonists who landed at Plymouth Rock adopted a narrative that allowed them to make sense of their place in the world and have hope for their future. Under this narrative, They viewed themselves as God's chosen people, modern-day Israelites who, like their predecessors, had suffered at the hands of the Egyptians, but would ultimately be rewarded for their faith. And the reward, of course, was a promised land, a land that the Pilgrims found in Massachusetts. Before they even arrived in the New World, this narrative was already in place. Standing on board the Arabella, the ship that led the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop described their mission to the New World as part of a bargain with God to do his work. Quote, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into a covenant with him for this work. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies." The power of this narrative was such that it transitioned smoothly from explaining the suffering of the Puritans as the chosen people of God to justifying their settlement of the land that had been, quote, promised to them. Following biblical precedent, colonists could understand their repeated wars with the Indians, prompted by their own encroachment on native lands, as the corollary of the wars which God helped the Israelites to win against the previous occupants of Canaan, their promised land. Seeing themselves as God's chosen people, merely claiming a land that was rightly theirs, helped European colonists and their descendants to make sense of the widespread death of native peoples from European diseases like smallpox. Uh-oh, what did I do? For example, Mary Murfin Smith, an English woman who had emigrated to what was now New Jersey as a child in 1678, recorded that, quote, "God's providence made room for us in a wonderful manner in taking away the Indians. There came a distemper among them so mortal that they could not bury all the dead. Others went away, leaving their town." The appeal of this narrative lasted into the Revolutionary era, when in the month following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson proposed that the seal of their new country bear images of the Israelites escaping Egypt to go to their new land. This is an image of the seal proposed by Franklin, which he described as showing, quote, "Moses standing on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who is sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand. Raised from a pillar of fire in the clouds, reaching to Moses to express that he acts by command of the deity. Motto, rebellion to tyrants and obedience to God." As the new nation expanded across the continent, white settlers continued to use this metaphor to justify the conquest of native lands, for who could stand against the children of Israel as they took over their promised land? In fact, as Hilton Obenzinger has observed, this very campus has an excellent illustration of this practice in the facade of the Judson Memorial Church. And I hope you guys recognize this image from walking here back and forth between here and the history department. I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can see it maybe a little better. In this image, a resurrected Jesus stands amid the palm trees of California with American mountains in the background. As Obenzinger writes, when viewing this mosaic from across the quad, quote, "California dissolved into Palestine from both before and behind the image of Jesus, and I marveled at the tightly wound typographical coil that powered the perpetual mechanism of the mural that allowed the old Holy Land to collapse into its newer Californian incarnation with unassuming ease. At the same time, the Mediterranean-inspired architecture set amid the mild Mediterranean-like hillsides of Palo Alto seemed only to reaffirm the basic ideological fact proclaimed by the mosaic on the church. California is itself the Holy Land." End quote. The centrality of this model of God-sanctioned settler colonialism at the moment of the foundation of what would become the United States has ramifications to this day, not only for Native rights, but also in the United States' support for the modern settler colonial state of Israel. Another very different kind of engagement with the past characterized the narrative that the children and grandchildren of these early settlers established to cope with the trauma of slavery, which quickly grew into an industry that sustained their colonies. So heinous, so self-evidently evil was this crime against humanity that they turned to their past again to support their actions. As has been traced by many scholars before me, the idea of race, whose legacy we struggle with still, emerged in the context of African enslavement in the New World. In particular, around the time of the American Revolution and afterwards, there was increasing pressure on white Americans who claimed that all men are created equal to explain why that all men did not include non-white people who were explicitly excluded from citizenship in the new nation. Within this context, and to cope with the trauma of their oppression of enslaved and free Black Americans, a narrative soon emerged that cast white male control over all others as inevitable and just, a narrative that linked modern white Americans genealogically to the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome, leapfrogging over their more recent predecessors in modern Europe. Unlike the divided nations of modern Europe, the Roman Empire offered a model for righteous empire, and, crucially, both ancient Greece and ancient Rome had slavery. White American engagement with classical antiquity in the 18th and 19th centuries was complex and multifaceted. I'd like to focus here on just one aspect, the architecture of power that was developed in the new nation. When the new state of Virginia transferred its capital from the colonial city of Williamsburg to Richmond, they chose to express their connection to this earlier civilization in the form of their new Capitol building. Whereas their old colonial Capitol building was designed in a style used in modern England, their new building was directly inspired by the Roman temple in Nîmes, in France. This new Capitol building, designed by Thomas Jefferson, was the first expression of a new architecture of power that signaled white American connections to classical antiquity. This style, and specifically the use of white columns with a triangular pediment, was later adopted in the building of the Capitol and of the White House in Washington, D.C., and soon expanded across the new nation, marking sites of power like courthouses and banks. It also became the dominant style of the wealthiest men in the country, the owners of the slave plantations of the South. The adoption of this style can in fact be tied quite directly to the timing of the creation of the new nation. In general, before the Revolutionary era, the classical elements in plantation houses were relatively subdued, as in this example from Maryland. Whereas after the Revolution, existing mansions were often remodeled to include monumental porticos, as happened here at Hampton in South Carolina. These facades were facades in more than one sense. While they imitated stone, they were really just wood and brick, covered with white plaster and painted to look like marble. This style became ubiquitous in the area of the Deep South, the lands that were opened up for cotton and sugar cultivation directly by the expulsion of Native Americans through the Trail of Tears. Staking their claims to the land, one of the first tasks that slave owners demanded of their slaves was to build them mansions in what they understood as their ancestral style. These houses, however, never existed in isolation, even though visitors today often encounter them that way. Instead, they were the control centers for massive industrial and agricultural estates, home to dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved Black people. The dominance of the white owners was further enforced through architecture, by reserving the classical style for their own homes and leaving the buildings where slaves worked and labored as unfinished wood with purely functional designs. And that's shown here in this picture with the mansion in the foreground. If you can see behind it on the right is one of the slave quarter buildings. And that's a very typical sort of contrast that was drawn visually between the different kinds of structures. One feature of trauma and what it creates is its existence in another time space. Called a disease of time by some, it is a capacity of trauma to place its sufferers in two time spaces at once. That is so well encapsulated in William Faulkner's famous statement that the past is never over, it is not even past. Whether through flashbacks, rituals of mourning, or retellings, the survivors of trauma are repeatedly drawn out of their present moment and into the past. Similarly, architecture and landscapes, whose creation is prompted by trauma, exist in this time between the past and the present, entering our perception today as scars of past trauma. But they are rarely interpreted as such. With a few exceptions, like concentration camps, many of these scars are instead interpreted in the present as heritage that we ought to be proud of. This is certainly the case for the plantation houses of the American South, which are massive tourist attractions and which consistently elide their traumatic pasts. Building and landscapes outlive their human creators, often by generations, carrying with them the physical reminders of past events. We certainly have an intuitive sense of this when it comes to places like slave plantations, or at least I assume the folks in this room do. But, for example, when Ani DeFranco announced plans to lead a songwriting retreat at Louisiana's Nottoway plantation, the Twitterverse exploded in horror. Toshi Regan, who is also scheduled to perform at the retreat, wrote, quote, "I don't like big white buildings. You can call it a mansion all you want. I just say it's the big house. Even though I never had to pick cotton, whenever I see places like that, I feel like I can see people picking cotton. So I would never want to be at Nottoway. I never would want to sing there." DeFranco issued multiple partial apologies and eventually canceled the retreat, but it's unclear whether she ever truly understood the reasons for people's outrage. In this, she is not alone. Throughout the South, slave plantations are sought-after venues for weddings. These are all images from Nottoway Plantation's own website under the tab where they advertise their wedding services. But just because the history witnessed and facilitated by these landscapes is not acknowledged by those who celebrate in them today, does not render it absent. Rather, such celebrations are in themselves reinscriptions of the same oppressions of white supremacy perpetrated on the plantations years ago. As wealthy white people party, they are served, as elsewhere in the South, by low-wage black workers, sometimes, and I'm serious about this sadly, even in period costume. Very different traumas, those of settler colonialism and of slavery, and the perpetrator guilt associated with them, were instrumental, I argue, in shaping American narratives of history and their place within it. Settler guilt associated with the Native American genocide and the theft of native lands, and enslaver guilt, heightened by the new nation's dependence upon a rhetoric of freedom and equality, can be seen as contributing to the white American reliance on ancient old world histories in order to excuse their inexcusable behavior. The intergenerational transmission of latent trauma has most often been studied from the perspective of those collectivities who have suffered from traumatic events or experiences, such as Native Americans and African Americans. In turning to the last section of my talk, I'd like to focus on a context in which the latent traumas are those of the descendants of the perpetrators, who themselves, often unknowingly, reproduce the oppression that has traumatized them and their victims. I'd like to move now to a context in which those traumas are not such an obvious part of the daily existence as they are in the American South, perhaps, meaning the states of New England. Over the course of a couple of hundred years now, as demonstrated so well by Joanne Mellish in her book, Disowning Slavery, white New Englanders have crafted an image of themselves as hardworking, God-fearing intellectuals who were never part of the system of slavery that pervaded the rest of European settlements in the New World. Further, they knew that their region had been a beacon of freedom, that runaway slaves had sought to reach it, and where they could openly join in an active abolition movement without fear of being sent back to their masters. They knew that they were in a place that never had legal segregation and that had supported the civil rights movement. They had so thoroughly whitewashed their history that they thought that all people of color in their 21st century world were recent migrants. Thus, when Brown University's president, Ruth Simmons, dared to open the door of inquiry into the history of the university's involvement with slavery, a process that was headed by now Stanford University professor Jim Campbell, that perpetrator trauma was brought to the surface in the form of aggressive statements about the value of the process and the impact that such a report could have on the reputation of Brown University. When the committee released their report 3 years later, the deep level of involvement of the university and its benefactors in slavery shocked most readers. It was revealed that nearly all of the founders of the university were slave traders, that the Brown family for which the university was named was among the worst, that the university and the Brown family also had a history of opposition to the slave trade, and more pointedly, that slavery was, in 18th and 19th century Rhode Island, literally the business of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. Although one of the comparanda that the report itself cited was South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process, the major difference here is that the trauma the report focused on was not one that was widely acknowledged, but rather was a latent trauma, one that, like the traumas of existence for so many women and people of color, had an impact without being consciously, discursively known to be traumas. 5 years after this process began, and 2 years after its conclusions were disseminated to the community, was a symbolic anniversary, the bicentennial of the United States' abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. A group of humanities scholars and art makers decided to mark the occasion with a celebration of African culture in Rhode Island and various memorializations of slavery, the slave trade, and their impact on the state. My own contribution to this process was the opening event, which sought to balance out the intellectualizing of the report and offer the residents of Providence, both Black and white, a chance to emotionally connect with and to process the trauma of the state's and city's multiple roles in the great crime of African enslavement in the New World. As with the plantations, the waterfront of Providence, Rhode Island, now a space of elite education and leisure, is a scarred landscape, which still has streets named for the trade that was once engaged in there, and buildings that were built and used for the business of slavery. The latent trauma stored within these walls, within these streets, was something that we sought to bring to light. We presented our installation as part of an event called Waterfire, which takes place about a dozen times every summer in Providence and consists of 100 braziers that are placed in a river downtown, lit at sunset, and kept burning until after midnight. This creates a moving ritual atmosphere, complete with performers, street food, and tens of thousands of people who come to the event, both from the local area and from around the country. At its heart is the same river from which slave voyages were launched more than 2 centuries earlier. The 1,000 Ships installation was co-created by the museum on site, which I co-direct, and the artist Barnaby Evans, who created and runs Waterfire. We collaborated with about a dozen local community organizations, ranging from the Rhode Island Black Storytellers to the Rhode Island Historical Society. The name of the event refers to the approximately 1,000 slave ship voyages that left from Rhode Island in the 17 and 1800s, accounting for approximately 60% of the entire US-based transatlantic slave trade. On the night of October 4th, 2008, approximately 30 people came to Waterfire, and most of them did not know that it was going to be different from any other night. We intentionally didn't advertise the event broadly because we wanted to catch people more or less unaware. As a result, these visitors were definitely not in the mood, so to speak, for learning or for solemn commemoration, as they might have been had they known what the theme of the evening was. Also, to be a bit cynical, I doubt we'd have had 30,000 people there if they knew it was going to be about slavery. As sunset neared, volunteers dressed in black with red sashes around their waists went through the crowd that was gathered to watch the fires being lit. They handed out small bottles of water, which contained a label and explaining what was going on that evening, and telling them that there were 1,000 water bottles being handed out, each of which represented one slave ship voyage from Rhode Island. The label also invited them to join us in pouring the water as a libation on a signal. As the braziers were lit, figures dressed in black with red sashes around their waists appeared in boats on the middle of the basin, and at points all around the edge of the basin, holding large silver bowls. Then, at the sound of Paul Robeson singing Amazing Grace, a song written by a reformed British slave ship captain, came over the loudspeakers, and the people holding the large bowls began to pour. The people who led this libation were all specially invited because of their connections to the history we were commemorating, including a chaplain from Brown University, the chair of the Slavery and Justice Committee, and the woman of this image, who made a documentary called Traces of the Trade about her family's involvement with the slave trade. When they saw this signal, the crowd came down to the waterfront to pour out their own bottles of water, commemorating something that less than half an hour before they may not have known anything about. Following the libation, an actor led a torch-lit procession of bearing witness, which stopped at various sites along the waterfront to explain their connection to the slave trade and the plantation provisioning trade. ranging from the market house, number 2 on this map, where commodities of all kind were traded, to the house of one of the slave-trading Brown brothers, number 3 on the map, to the warehouses where rum and other trade goods had been stored, redefining the landscape of the center of the city in terms of this important but largely unknown history. At each site, the procession stopped, learned the history that was connected to that site, and lit a torch to represent the site before continuing on to the next location. At the same time, 6 actors walked among the crowd, and every few minutes a torch would be lit, and they would read aloud the text of historical documents related to slavery in Rhode Island, including letters from slave ship captains to owners of those ships back in Rhode Island, and accounts of the auctions of slave ships, and accounts of the auctions of slaves captured on Rhode Island ships, as well as speeches against slavery made by Rhode Island politicians, excerpts from the slave narrative of a boy who was enslaved in Rhode Island as well. These speeches were all very short, between 20 seconds and 2 minutes, after which the torch would be extinguished and the actor would move on, allowing the audience to choose whether they wanted to learn more and follow, or return to conversation and contemplation with their companions. Just to read you one quick example of the kind of texts that were read. Sales of cargo from the brig Sally, owned by Nicholas Brown and Company, Providence, Rhode Island. Antigua, 1765. October 17th, six slaves sold to Mr. John Lindsay for 90 pounds. October 19th, 2 small sick girls sold to Mrs. Mary Lindsay for 9 pounds, 18 shillings. 3 sick men sold at auction for 39 pounds, 17 shillings. October 27th, 4 sick boys sold to Mrs. West for 38 pounds. November 2nd, 3 slaves sold to Mr. Williams for 27 pounds. November 16th, 11 slaves sold for 185 pounds, 10 shillings, 9 pence. 4 sick slaves sold for 45 pounds, 9 shillings. One of the most remarkable aspects of this element of the event was seeing how it worked on the audience, who were initially very excited by the lighting of a torch and gathered eagerly to see the performance. But their expressions changed, and they became very glued to the spot as they realized what was being said. These horrible words that put prices on human beings, all the time unavoidably connected to Providence and to Rhode Island. After about an hour of these performances, both the procession of bearing witness and the actors led spectators to an adjoining riverside park, where a triangle of trees had been wrapped in 400 feet of paper chain, representing the triangle trade of slavery. This triangle was surrounded on all sides by torchbearers and set on fire. The effect was amazing. It lit up the faces of the crowd, and there was a real sense of release and catharsis. One audience member later said, quote, "It was better than having a baby. It really was that thrilling for me." Immediately after the chains had been burnt, a local gospel choir sang in one corner of the now open triangle, and we invited the audience to join us in placing 1,000 luminaria, which are essentially candles inside of flame-proof paper bags, in the triangular space opened up by the fire. One of the most moving moments of the night for me. Young children spontaneously took the lead in laying luminaria, going up to strangers to give them luminaria and explaining that these candles were for slaves. By the end, the collection of luminaria was quite breathtaking, forever marking that space in the memories of those who were there. Next to the triangle throughout the night, staffed by scholars of history and race, was a table where people could go to discuss and learn more about the history and pick up free copies of Brown University's Slavery and Justice Report. At the end of the evening, a tent was set up for our community partners and all of our volunteers to meet and reflect on the experience over food and drink. And we continued the conversation the following day in a public symposium at Brown University, where we invited scholars and community members to discuss the effectiveness of 1,000 ships and the way forward for thinking and talking about this traumatic history in Rhode Island. The success of 1,000 ships, which reached tens of thousands of people, moving far beyond a typical museum-going audience, was due to its engagement with the story that was deeply linked to the past and present of the specific place. The history that we presented was one that our audience somehow knew they didn't know. No one challenged the veracity of our presentation or our right to offer it in the place where we did. It was as if a kind of transgenerational haunting affirmed the appropriateness, the necessity of this work. Although the rituals themselves were not familiar to the audience, they were effective because of how they built on a shared symbolic vocabulary. While we thought of 1,000 Ships as a memorial event, its ephemerality meant that its only permanent presence is in the minds of those who experienced it. Just last year, however, Brown University continued its memory work, establishing a slavery memorial on its campus. Designed by Martin Puryear, this monument will be a permanent reminder of the disruption of slavery and the university's role within it. But as Ron Ehrman writes, to memorialize is to force a memory on us by conspicuous and continuous physical presence of a monument. At the same time, a memorial also conveys the message that we have now paid our respects to a trauma. We are now justified in forgetting about it. Whether memory work will continue around Rhode Island's traumatic past and segregated present remains to be seen. Thank you, and my contact information is here along with a web link where you can find more information about the 1,000 Ships observation.
And we have time for a couple questions.
If anybody has any.
I think there was one over there.
I hadn't thought my question through before raising my hand. I'll go, could you talk about shared, what did you call it? Shared symbolic vocabulary, ritual vocabulary, both in building it and also its relationship to cultural appropriation?
Yeah, thank you. That was actually something that we were very sensitive to and wanted to make sure that we were presenting, particularly in terms of libation, I don't know if that's what you're thinking of, was not presented as an authentic ritual, that it wasn't. And so in that regard, I'm sure many of you know libation is a common ritual in a lot of West African cultures, and that was one reason why it came to mind. It's also a common ritual in some other ancient cultures in Europe as well. And we, in many ways, we chose it because it involved water, right? Because we wanted to do something that involved the element that was so central to this trade. And also because it wasn't something that was associated with any major religion in the US today, right? So that it wasn't, a Christian ritual or a Jewish ritual or something that was, going to feel specifically like it was one group's ritual and not others. And yet, that it still had this incredible power that was sort of intuitive, right? That people, even without knowing what it was or having done it before, they understood somehow that this was something that you could do, right? And that did have meaning as a group process. And that's why it wasn't, we actually did, well, originally we actually were going to have an actual traditional libation that was part of it as well, but we ended up having to move the event because of a hurricane, and the person who was going to do that couldn't come to the rescheduled event. But such is life. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Can I just say that
Yeah.
the basis for the question is that as someone who wants to create more and more ritual, like how to build
Yeah.
this vocabulary while being respectful,
Yeah. It's complicated. It's super complicated, and I mean, I'm not sure that we succeeded, right? I'm the few West Africans who I knew who were at the event thought it was awesome, but they're not. Nobody has the right to speak for whether or not something is okay in terms of cultural appropriation.
I was really interested in your belief that trauma is ubiquitous. And I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that because I think of trauma so much as victims and perpetrators. And so maybe more about the relationship between the two.
I guess what I'm getting at there is, well, I mean, first of all, individual traumatic experiences, like the ones that we think about as being more traditional sort of Western concepts of trauma, are incredibly common, right? I mean, I'm guessing without a show of hands that probably everyone in this room, either themselves or in their parents' generation, has something really seriously traumatic that's happened to them. So in that sense, I really think it's much more of a norm than we pretend that it is when we think about it as being something that is, you know, oh my God, you're traumatized, let's take care of that, right? Which is not to say, you know, don't treat people who are traumatized, but rather that I think that the cultural function of trauma and its role is much more, it has a much bigger cultural function than I think we acknowledge it to have when we treat it as a disease that we need to treat, and then we'll be better, and then we'll go back to normal. You know what I mean?
One last question.
Thank you for your talk. I have so many questions, but I think that I'm interested in this question of what we decide, since if trauma is ubiquitous and all of these traumas are still affecting us, then I think that when there's a kind of fetishization of certain traumatic events, that we feel very satisfied in memorializing and that administrations can get behind. That do we have to do, in a sense, a very paradoxical kind of weird counter work, not to not remember those experiences, but to open up spaces that might be more hidden. I was thinking when you were talking, like, that's amazing. I live in Atlanta, and I used to live in Providence. And
Oh, cool.
so I was like, oh my God, I didn't really realize that. I never thought about that plantations. Then I looked down and I'm wearing, all of my clothes were made in sweatshops. You know, and you know that my entire presentation is based on the traumas of people that are alive. And we all know that, I think, here, but this way of the satisfaction that one feels in memorializing certain events and the real disruption to the narrative in recalling other kinds of trauma. And that seems to be what the Brown work was trying to do, but I was wondering if you had any ideas about that, about what if everything is traumatic, what happens to a trauma once we accept it as a trauma that we then can, you know, get money for and to memorialize, and what happens to those traumas that are kind of emerging that we don't yet have a memory industry, in a sense, to work through?
I'm not sure this answers your question, but I actually don't think that it is necessarily sort of a progressive thing that we will eventually recognize more and more traumas. I think that there are certain traumas that will not get state recognition ever, or collective recognition. I think that it's violence against women is a thing that is obviously a mass trauma in this country, and we've managed to not make it a collective trauma for a very long time, and I don't really see us doing that anytime soon, or ever, really, because it doesn't fit with the narrative of our country. That doesn't mean that individuals can't do various kinds of memory work around it, and I hope, and I know that people do, and I hope that people continue to, but I think that there will always be traumas that don't get acknowledged in that way.
Well, thank you all so much, and I believe it is now time for us to head back to Building 200 in the History Department for our next panels. Please join me in thanking both of our plenary speakers for wonderful talks today.